It was a Friday evening in early October, the kind where the air feels crisp but not cold, and the sky holds on to the last golden streaks of sunset, long after the sun has dipped below the city skyline. Downtown sparkled under soft streetlights. Cars hummed along wet pavement from an earlier drizzle, and people moved with that relaxed energy that only comes at the start of a weekend. For the couple getting out of a modest but well-kept sedan parked just outside a quiet side street in the historic district, this night meant more than just dinner. It was their 10th wedding anniversary. 10 years of shared mornings, late-night talks, hospital shifts, court dates, grocery runs, and quiet moments that never made it onto social media, but held everything together. They'd been saving this night for months, not because they needed a grand gesture, but because they wanted to remember how far they'd come. Just the two of them, dressed up and stepping into something beautiful. He wore a charcoal suit he'd had tailored 2 years ago, but rarely took out of the closet. Only for funerals, weddings, or nights like this. She chose a deep emerald dress, simple but elegant, the kind that didn't shout for attention but made people look twice anyway. They'd laughed in the car on the way over about how stiff they felt in their fancy clothes, how their usual Friday night involved takeout and reruns of old sitcoms. But tonight was different. Tonight they were honoring themselves, their love, their resilience, the quiet strength it took to build a life together in a world that didn't always make space for them. The restaurant they were heading to, Le Jardin Étoilé, was the kind of place you heard about in whispers. Tucked between a boutique bookstore and a closed art gallery, its entrance was unassuming. A black awning, brass handles on heavy wooden doors, a small brass plaque with the name etched in delicate script. No flashing signs, no loud music, just an air of quiet exclusivity. It had 1 Michelin star, a wine list longer than most novels, and a reputation for discretion. Reservations opened exactly 30 days in advance and filled within minutes. Getting a table on a Friday night? That took planning, patience, and a bit of luck. They'd booked it 6 weeks ago the moment the calendar opened. She'd set an alarm on her phone, clicked reserve at midnight, and actually cheered when the confirmation email popped up. He'd teased her for getting so excited over a dinner, but secretly, he was just as proud. It felt like a small victory, proof that they belonged in spaces like this too. As they approached the door, he reached for her hand. Not out of habit, but intention. A silent, "We've got this." She squeezed back, her fingers warm against his. They stepped inside. The change was immediate. Outside, the city buzzed with noise and motion. Inside, it was hushed, almost reverent. Soft piano music floated from hidden speakers. The lighting was low but warm, casting gentle pools of gold over white linen tables and dark wood floors. Crystal glasses caught the light like scattered stars. The scent of rosemary, seared butter, and something faintly floral, maybe lavender, hung in the air. It smelled expensive but not overwhelming, just cared for. A woman in a crisp black dress stood behind a small podium near the entrance. Her hair was pulled back tightly, her expression neutral, professional. She glanced up as they entered, her eyes flicking over them for half a second too long before returning to her screen. "Good evening," she said, voice smooth but distant. "Do you have a reservation?" He nodded. "Yes, under Thompson. Party of 2. 7 o'clock. She tapped at her keyboard, her brow furrowing slightly. "Thompson?" she murmured, as if the name didn't quite fit in her system. She checked again. Then again. He didn't say anything, but his shoulders tensed just a fraction. He'd been here before, not in this restaurant, but in this moment. That pause. That tiny hesitation that always came before the polite brush-off or the sudden, "we're fully booked" lie. He kept his face calm, though. No point making a scene before they'd even sat down. After what felt like a full minute but was probably only 10 seconds, she finally looked up. "Ah, yes, we have you." Her tone didn't change, but something in her posture shifted. Less certainty, more caution. "Please follow me." She led them through the main dining room. It was beautiful. Candlelit tables, couples in fine clothes, waiters gliding silently with silver trays. But as they walked, he noticed how a few heads turned. Not with curiosity exactly, more like assessment. One man in a navy blazer glanced at them, then quickly looked back at his wine glass. An older woman adjusted her napkin with extra care, her eyes darting away when he caught her gaze. They were led past the center of the room, past the tables near the windows with the best views, past the cozy booths by the fireplace. Instead, they were guided toward the very back, near a narrow hallway that probably led to restrooms or staff areas. The table was smaller than the others, tucked beside a tall potted fern that blocked part of the view. It wasn't dirty or broken, just forgotten. "Here you are," the hostess said, placing 2 menus on the table. "Your server will be with you shortly." She didn't smile, didn't wish them a good evening. Just turned and walked away, heels clicking softly against the hardwood. For a moment, they just stood there taking it in. Then she let out a quiet breath, half sigh, half laugh. "Well," she said, slipping into her chair, "at least we made it inside." He sat down slowly, smoothing his jacket. "Yeah," he said. "That's something." They opened their menus. The prices were steep, $42 for a salad, $68 for sea bass, but they'd expected that. This wasn't about the food, really. It was about the experience, the chance to be treated like anyone else who could afford it. To sit in a beautiful room, enjoy a meal, and not have to carry the weight of being the only ones in the room. Their server arrived a few minutes later, a young man with a neatly trimmed beard and a practiced smile. "Welcome," he said warmly. "Can I start you off with something to drink? We have an excellent sommelier if you'd like a recommendation." They ordered sparkling water to start, then debated wine. She leaned in, pointing to a Burgundy on the list. "This one?" He nodded. "Sounds perfect." As the server walked away, she reached across the table and touched his hand. "Don't let it get to you," she said softly. "We're here. We're together. That's what matters." He smiled, really smiled this time. "You're right." And for a moment, the tension in his chest eased. They clinked their water glasses. "To 10 years. To 10 more," she replied. The first course arrived. Tiny, perfect bites of goat cheese tartlet with honey and thyme. They ate slowly, savoring each bite, talking in low voices about nothing important. The neighbor's new dog, the book she was reading, the weird dream he'd had about flying over the city. Normal things. Happy things. Around them, other diners laughed, toasted, leaned in close. No one looked their way. No one came over to complain. No music played too loudly. They weren't talking loudly. They weren't arguing. They weren't doing anything out of the ordinary. Just 2 people enjoying a quiet anniversary dinner, like hundreds of other couples in restaurants across the city that night. But still, that feeling lingered, the one he couldn't quite name. Not fear exactly, more like waiting, like something was coiled beneath the surface, ready to snap. He'd learned over the years to trust that feeling. It had kept him safe more times than he could count. She seemed to sense it too. Her laughter grew a little quieter. Her eyes scanned the room once or twice, not suspiciously, but carefully. She'd learned to read rooms too, to notice who made space for them and who didn't. Still, they tried to relax. They ordered the main course, duck confit for him, wild mushroom risotto for her. The food arrived beautifully plated, steaming gently under the soft lights. They dug in, and for a few minutes, it was just about the taste, the texture, the shared pleasure of something well made. Then, halfway through the meal, he saw the manager, a man in a dark suit, late 40s with silver at his temples, emerged from a side door near the kitchen. He moved with authority, nodding at staff, checking tables with a clipboard. His eyes swept the room, and when they landed on their table, they paused. Just for a second, but it was enough. The man didn't approach right away. He spoke to a waiter, then glanced back. Then he walked toward the hostess stand and said something low and urgent. The hostess nodded, her face tight. His stomach dropped. "Hey," he said quietly, leaning toward her. "Keep eating, but I think something's coming." She didn't panic. She just set her fork down slowly. "Okay," she said. "We'll handle it." 2 minutes later, the manager was walking toward them, followed by 2 large men in plain clothes. Security, though they wore no uniforms. Their faces were blank, unreadable. The manager stopped at the edge of their table. He didn't smile, didn't greet them, just stood there, hands clasped in front of him like a headmaster about to deliver bad news. "I'm sorry," he began, voice low but firm, "but we've received multiple complaints from other guests. They say you're making them uncomfortable." She blinked. "Uncomfortable how?" "You're speaking too loudly," he said, though they'd been talking in near whispers. "And your presence is disruptive." He looked up, calm but direct. We haven't raised our voices. We haven't done anything unusual. We're just having dinner." "I understand," the manager said, not sounding like he understood at all. "But for the comfort of our other patrons, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The words hung in the air like smoke. She stared at him. "You're asking us to leave because we're black?" He didn't say it outright, but the silence said everything. Around them, the room seemed to hold its breath. A few diners looked away. Others watched openly, forks frozen midair. He stood slowly, carefully placing his napkin on the table. She followed, her hand steady despite the heat rising in her chest. They didn't argue, didn't yell. They simply gathered their coats, paid the bill for the food they'd barely touched because they refused to give the restaurant the satisfaction of walking out on it, and walked out the front door, heads high. Outside, the cool night air hit their faces like a splash of water. The city sounds rushed back. The honk of a distant horn, the rumble of a bus, the chatter of people leaving a nearby theater. She turned to him, eyes glistening but dry. "Can you believe that?" He took a deep breath and pulled out his phone. Not to call a lawyer, not yet. Just to press record. Standing there on the sidewalk, under the glow of a street lamp, he spoke clearly into the camera, his voice calm but edged with something hard and unbreakable. "We came here to celebrate 10 years of marriage. We had a reservation. We followed every rule. And we were asked to leave, without cause, without evidence, simply because of who we are." He stopped recording, looked at her. "They think this is the end of the story," he said. She nodded, slipping her arm through his. "But it's just the beginning." And with that they walked away, not in shame but in quiet defiance, leaving the glittering restaurant behind, its doors closed, its secrets still inside. For now, the sidewalk felt colder than it should have, not from the weather, the night was mild, almost gentle, but from the weight of what had just happened. They walked slowly, not because they were unsure where to go, but because neither wanted to rush past the moment. It needed to be felt, fully, before it could be processed. She kept her arm looped through his, her fingers occasionally tightening around his sleeve like an anchor. He didn't say much at first, just walked, eyes straight ahead, jaw set but not clenched. Inside, though, his mind was racing. Not with anger, not yet, but with that familiar, exhausting calculation. Was it something I did? Did I laugh too loud? Did I sit too confidently? He knew the answer, of course. But knowing and feeling were two different things. After a block, she stopped under a flickering street lamp. "Let's sit for a minute," she said, nodding toward a small bench outside a closed flower shop. The wooden slats were damp from the earlier drizzle, but they sat anyway. He pulled out his phone again, not to record this time, but to look at the short video he'd taken outside the restaurant. He played it back once, then again. His voice sounded steady, calm, almost too calm, like he'd rehearsed it 100 times in his head over the years, just in case. "You should post it," she said quietly. He looked up. "You sure?" She nodded. "They think no one will believe us. Or worse, they think no one will care. Let's prove them wrong." He hesitated. Posting something like this wasn't just about sharing an injustice. It was opening a door to comments, to doubt, to strangers dissecting your pain like it was entertainment. But then he thought about all the times he'd stayed silent. All the times he'd told himself, it's not worth the trouble, and how that silence had only made space for more of the same. "Okay," he said. She pulled out her own phone and opened her social media app. She didn't have millions of followers, just friends, family, colleagues, a few local community groups, but her posts always got thoughtful engagement. She typed slowly, choosing each word like it mattered because it did. 10 years ago today, we promised to stand by each other. Tonight, we kept that promise by walking out of a place that tried to make us feel small. We had a reservation. We followed every rule. And we were asked to leave simply because we're a black couple. Attached is the video. Share if you believe dignity shouldn't depend on your skin color. She hit post. Neither of them expected what came next. At first, nothing. Just the quiet hum of the city and the distant wail of a siren. They sat for another 10 minutes, talking about whether to grab coffee somewhere else or just head home. They decided on home. Neither felt like pretending to enjoy another nice place tonight. But by the time they got into their car, her phone buzzed. Then buzzed again. And again. "What's happening?" he asked, starting the engine. She stared at her screen, eyes wide. People are sharing it. A lot. Within 20 minutes, the post had been shared over 500 times. Comments poured in. This is disgusting. I've eaten there, never saw this side. So sorry. Thank you for speaking up. This happens more than people admit. One comment stood out. A woman who wrote, I was there tonight. I saw it happen. I didn't say anything and I'm ashamed. But I'm speaking now. That one hit hard, not because it was shocking, but because it was true. How many times had good people stayed quiet, not out of malice, but fear? Fear of making a scene, of being wrong, of losing their own comfort. By the time they pulled into their driveway, the post had over 2,000 shares. A local journalist had already sent a direct message asking if they'd be willing to talk. Inside their house, the familiar warmth wrapped around them like a blanket. Photos on the walls, wedding day, vacations, holidays with family, a half-finished puzzle on the kitchen table. Their dog, an old golden retriever named Buddy, thumped his tail against the floor as they walked in as if to say, You're home. You're safe here. She poured 2 glasses of red wine, nothing fancy, just the bottle they kept for weeknights, and they sat at the kitchen table, phones still lighting up like fireflies in the dim room. I keep thinking about that couple by the window, she said suddenly, the ones who looked away when the manager came over. I saw them too, he said. They could have said something, even just, and we don't mind them being here, but they didn't. No, there was no bitterness in her voice, just sadness. Because it wasn't really about that one couple. It was about a system that taught people, especially people who looked like them, that their presence was a privilege, not a right. That they had to be twice as good, half as loud, and endlessly grateful just to be tolerated. They stayed up late, not watching TV, not scrolling mindlessly, but talking. Really talking. About how tired it was to always be the example, to always have to be perfect just to be treated fairly. About how they'd both learned from childhood to shrink themselves in certain spaces, to laugh softer, walk slower, dress respectably, just to avoid suspicion. And yet tonight none of that had mattered. They'd done everything right, and it still wasn't enough. The next morning, the story had exploded. National news outlets picked it up. Food bloggers condemned the restaurant. Former employees started coming forward in anonymous posts, describing a culture where certain guests were routinely seated in the back, given slower service, or quietly turned away if they didn't fit the vibe. One ex-waiter said the manager had once told staff, "We cater to a refined clientele," and everyone knew what that meant. Their video had been viewed over 500,000 times. They woke to a flood of messages, some supportive, some skeptical, a few outright cruel, but the overwhelming response was solidarity. People shared their own stories, being followed in stores, denied rideshares, questioned about their jobs or homes, all because of how they looked. A local civil rights organization reached out, offering legal support. A popular food critic announced she was canceling her upcoming reservation at the restaurant and urged her followers to do the same. Meanwhile, inside Le Jardin Étoilé, chaos unfolded. Reservation calls poured in, not to book tables but to cancel them. By noon, over 80% of weekend bookings had been scrapped. Staff members whispered in the kitchen, some furious, others embarrassed. One server posted on social media, "I served them. They were kind, quiet, and generous with their tip. This is on management, not the staff." The owner, who'd been vacationing in Tuscany, cut his trip short and flew back overnight. He arrived at the restaurant Saturday morning, pale and flustered, demanding a full report. The manager tried to explain. They were making people uncomfortable, but the owner cut him off. Uncomfortable? They were eating risotto in the back corner. What exactly were they doing, breathing while black? The manager stammered, but the damage was done. The owner knew the brand was burning. Michelin had already sent a discreet inquiry. Investors were calling. The restaurant's carefully curated image of elegance and exclusivity was cracking under the weight of its own prejudice. Back at home, the couple debated what to do next. They weren't looking for money. They didn't want free meals for life or a public grovel. What they wanted was accountability, change, not just for them, but for the next couple who walked in, hoping to celebrate something beautiful, only to be told they didn't belong. They agreed to speak with the local news station. Not for fame, but because silence had protected places like this for too long. The interview was simple. They sat on their living room couch, Buddy curled at their feet. The reporter asked gentle questions. They answered honestly, about the reservation, the seating, the vague accusation, the walkout. They didn't exaggerate, didn't dramatize, just told what happened in plain words. When it aired that evening, the response was overwhelming. Donations started pouring into a local racial equity nonprofit they'd mentioned in passing. A group of restaurant owners in the city issued a joint statement condemning discrimination in the hospitality industry and announcing mandatory bias training for their staff. Even the city council took notice, with one member proposing a review of anti-discrimination enforcement in private businesses. But the most surprising message came Sunday afternoon. It was from a woman who identified herself only as a regular at Le Jardin. She wrote, "I've dined there for years. I always thought it was just exclusive. I never questioned why I never saw people who looked like you. Last night I realized I was part of the problem. I stayed quiet. I accepted the vibe without asking who got to define it. I'm sorry, and I won't be going back, not until real change happens." That message made them pause, because it wasn't about blame. It was about awakening, and maybe, just maybe, that was the first real crack in the wall. By Monday, the restaurant's Instagram page was flooded with comments. Some angry, some supportive of the couple, many demanding answers. The owner finally posted a statement. Le Jardin Étoilé deeply regrets the incident that occurred Friday night. We are committed to reviewing our policies, retraining our staff, and ensuring all guests feel welcome. We have reached out to the couple to apologize personally and make amends. It was vague, carefully worded, designed more to stop the bleeding than to heal the wound. But the couple didn't respond immediately. They took their time, talked it over, consulted with the civil rights group. Because they knew something the restaurant didn't, apologies without action were just noise. And they were done listening to noise. Instead of accepting a private apology, they made a public request. They asked the restaurant to 1. Release a full, transparent report on staff training and hiring practices. Partner with a third-party diversity consultant for at least 1 year. Donate to a fund supporting Black-owned restaurants in the city. No grand gestures, no photo ops, just concrete steps toward real change. The owner hesitated. These weren't the easy fixes he'd hoped for. But with reservations still canceled, staff morale low, and Michelin watching closely, he had little choice. Late Monday night, he agreed. The couple didn't celebrate. Not yet, because they knew this wasn't over. One restaurant changing didn't fix the system. But it was a start, a ripple. That night, they ordered pizza, pepperoni and mushrooms, their favorite, and ate it on the couch, Buddy begging for scraps. Outside, the world kept spinning. But inside there was peace, not because they'd won, but because they'd refused to disappear. And in doing so, they'd reminded everyone watching that dignity wasn't something you earned by dressing nicely or speaking softly. It was something you were born with, and no restaurant, no matter how fancy, had the right to take it away. The story didn't fade. That was the first surprise. Usually these things flared up for a day or two, maybe a week if it was especially outrageous, then vanished under the next wave of headlines. But this time people held on. They shared. They questioned. They remembered. By the end of the second week, what had started as a quiet video from a sidewalk had become something much bigger. Not just a personal injustice, but a mirror held up to an entire industry and the city itself. It began with the former employees. At first, they came forward anonymously, blurry screenshots of old group chats, voice notes scrubbed of identifying details, vague but chilling messages posted to community forums. One wrote, "We were told to watch certain guests. Not the ones in designer clothes or speaking French, but the ones who looked different." Another shared a photo of a staff memo that read, "Maintain the ambiance. Discretion is key." No one defined what ambiance meant, but everyone knew. Then came the guests. A woman posted a photo of her receipt from 2 months earlier. She'd been seated in the same back corner, near the restrooms, even though the dining room was half empty. A man recalled being asked 3 times for his reservation confirmation, while white couples walked straight in. Another couple described how their server barely made eye contact, rushed through the menu, and disappeared for long stretches until they left a generous tip, at which point he suddenly became warm and attentive. These weren't isolated incidents. They were patterns. And now, with the spotlight on, those patterns were impossible to ignore. Local news stations, which had initially treated the story as a he said, she said drama, began digging deeper. Reporters visited the restaurant unannounced, posing as guests. They noted how the hostess hesitated when they mentioned their last name, a common surname in the black community, and how they were offered a table in the quieter section, despite the main room having open seats. They recorded the manager's vague answers when asked about diversity training. He claimed it was ongoing, but couldn't name a single session or provider. The city's Human Rights Commission opened a formal investigation, not just into that one night, but into the restaurant's hiring practices, customer complaints over the past 5 years, and internal communications. Subpoenas were issued. Lawyers got involved. But the real turning point came from an unexpected place: the food world itself. Michelin, known for its secrecy and silence, broke its usual protocol. In a rare public statement, it announced it was reviewing the standing of Le Jardin Étoilé. Not revoking the star yet, but signaling that excellence wasn't just about food. It was about values. That sent shockwaves through the culinary elite. For years, fine dining had operated under an unspoken code. As long as the food was perfect and the wealthy were happy, everything else could be ignored. But now that code was cracking. Chefs across the country began speaking out. Some posted black squares on their Instagrams. Others shared stories of their own staff facing discrimination in high-end kitchens. A James Beard Award-winning chef in New York wrote an op-ed titled, "Excellence without equity is just elitism." Locally, things moved even faster. A group of 23 restaurant owners, many of them women, many of them people of color, released a joint pledge. They promised to implement mandatory anti-bias training, diversify their hiring, and create clear channels for guests to report discrimination without fear. They called it the Table for All initiative. Within days, over 100 more businesses signed on. Even the restaurant's suppliers got involved. A local organic farm that provided their heirloom tomatoes announced it would suspend deliveries until meaningful change was demonstrated. A boutique wine importer pulled its rare vintages from the menu. Inside Le Jardin Étoilé, the atmosphere grew tense. Reservations remained nearly empty. The once bustling kitchen now echoed with silence. Staff members whispered in corners, some packing their things, others waiting to see if the owner would actually follow through on his promises. The manager, the one who'd asked the couple to leave, was gone. Officially, he'd stepped down to pursue other opportunities. Unofficially, everyone knew he'd been fired. But firing one person wasn't enough. The rot went deeper. Meanwhile, the couple stayed grounded. They didn't do interviews every day. Didn't chase the spotlight. They went back to their lives. She to her clinic, where kids still needed checkups and vaccines. He to his office, where clients still needed legal help with housing disputes and workplace rights. But in the evenings, they met with community leaders, civil rights attorneys, and young activists who saw their story as a blueprint for change. They weren't celebrities. They were just 2 people who'd said, "This isn't right," and refused to walk away quietly. One afternoon, a high school teacher reached out. She'd shown the video in her social studies class. Her students, mostly teenagers of color, were stunned. "They couldn't believe it happened in our city," she wrote. They asked, "Is this still happening?" I didn't know how to answer. That message stayed with them, because it wasn't just about a restaurant. It was about what young people were learning about the world, and their place in it. Then came the apology. Not the first one, the vague, PR-approved statement from the owner. This was different. Late one Tuesday night, a handwritten letter arrived in their mailbox. No logo, no return address, just cream-colored paper in careful cursive. It read, "I was the hostess who seated you that night. I followed orders without thinking. I told myself it was just policy, that I was just doing my job. But watching your video, seeing your faces, calm, dignified, hurt, I realized I was part of the harm. I quit the next morning. I'm now volunteering with a group that helps minority-owned restaurants get licensed and funded. I can't undo what happened, but I'm trying to build something better. Thank you for making me see. They read it twice, then folded it carefully and put it in a drawer. Not to forget, but to remember that change could start with one person waking up. The media kept calling. National outlets wanted them on morning shows. Podcasts asked for hour-long interviews. A documentary filmmaker reached out, but they said no to most of it. They didn't want to become symbols. They wanted to be catalysts, so they focused on action. With the civil rights organization, they helped draft a proposal for the city. Mandatory bias training for all hospitality businesses with over 20 employees. Anonymous guest feedback systems and public reporting of discrimination complaints. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. They also declined the restaurant's offer of a private meeting, not out of spite but principle. If they're serious, they told the reporter who asked, they'll make changes publicly, not behind closed doors. The owner, cornered and losing money by the day, finally agreed to a public forum. It was held at the city's community center, not in the restaurant, not in a fancy hotel, but in a plain room with folding chairs and fluorescent lights. Over 200 people showed up. Former guests, staff, activists, curious neighbors, even a few food critics. The owner stood at the front, visibly nervous. He didn't wear a suit, just a simple button-down, sleeves rolled up. He spoke without notes. I was wrong, he began. Not just about that night, but about how I ran my business for years. I thought excellence meant perfection on the plate. I didn't realize it also meant integrity in how we treat people. I let bias become part of our culture, and I didn't stop it. That ends now. He outlined the steps they'd taken, hiring a third-party diversity firm, auditing all past hiring and seating records, creating a guest ombudsman position, and donating $50,000 to a fund for Black culinary entrepreneurs. Then he turned to the couple. I know an apology can't erase what happened, but I'm committed to making sure no one else feels what you felt in my restaurant. There was silence. Not hostile, not forgiving, just waiting. The couple didn't stand up to speak. They didn't need to. Their presence was enough. After the forum, people lingered, talked, shared stories, made plans. A young Black chef approached them, eyes bright. I've been trying to open my own place for 3 years, he said. Every bank turned me down. Every landlord said not the right fit. But seeing you stand your ground, it gave me hope. That moment meant more than any apology. In the days that followed, the story took on a new life. It wasn't just about Le Jardin Étoilé anymore. It was about every space that claimed to be exclusive while quietly excluding. About every person who'd been told, directly or indirectly, that they didn't belong. Restaurants across the city began posting their own diversity statements. Some were performative. Others felt genuine. But the conversation had shifted. Even Yelp added a new feature, a community feedback section where guests could report experiences of bias or discrimination, reviewed by a third party before going live. Back at home, the couple finally allowed themselves a quiet moment of reflection. They sat on their porch one evening, sipping tea as fireflies blinked in the yard. The dog lay at their feet, snoring softly. You know, she said, I keep thinking about how we just wanted a nice dinner. 10 years. A little celebration, he nodded. And instead we got all this. But maybe that's the point, she said. Maybe the reason it hurt so much is because it wasn't just about dinner. It was about being seen. Really seen, he reached for her hand. And now people see us. Not just as a couple who got kicked out, but as people who stood up. They didn't know what would happen next. Would the restaurant survive? Would the city pass the new rules? Would anything really change? But they'd learned something important. Impact wasn't always loud. Sometimes it started with a quiet no in a fancy dining room. And sometimes, that no echoed farther than anyone expected. Later that week, they received another message, this time from a small cafe on the other side of town. The owner, a Black woman who'd opened her place 5 years ago after being denied loans everywhere else, invited them to dinner. On the house, she wrote, not because you're famous, but because you reminded us that our tables matter too. They accepted. And this time, when they walked in, the hostess smiled warmly, led them to the best table by the window and said, Welcome. We've been waiting for you. No hesitation. No pause, just belonging. It felt simple. Ordinary even. But after everything, it felt like everything. The apology came wrapped in velvet, literally. A thick envelope arrived at their home one Tuesday morning, tied with a deep burgundy ribbon and stamped with the restaurant's discreet logo. Inside was a handwritten note from the owner, printed on heavy cream paper, and a glossy brochure outlining what they called a new chapter for Le Jardin Étoilé. At the bottom of the packet was a gift card, good for a lifetime of dining experiences, as the note put it, and a check for $50,000, made out to a racial equity nonprofit of their choice. The tone was earnest, almost humble. The owner wrote that he'd spent sleepless nights reflecting, that he'd met with staff, consulted experts, and restructured everything from hiring to seating protocols. He promised transparency, accountability, and a renewed commitment to welcoming all guests with dignity. It looked good on paper, sounded good in words, but as they sat at their kitchen table reading it over coffee, neither of them felt relief. They felt tired because they'd seen this before. Not this exact offer, no one had ever sent them a lifetime of free meals, but the pattern was familiar. The grand gesture, the public show of remorse, the attempt to buy peace instead of building justice. It was easier to write a check than to change a culture. Easier to say we're sorry than to ask, how do we make sure this never happens again? She set the envelope down gently like it might break. They think this fixes it? He stirred his coffee, watching the swirls fade. They think this makes us go away, and maybe in another life they would have. Taken the gift card, cashed the check, posted a gracious thank you online, and moved on. After all, they weren't activists by trade. They had jobs, bills, a dog who needed walks, a house that needed repairs. They didn't wake up every morning looking for a fight. But something had shifted that night on the sidewalk. It wasn't just about them anymore. They'd heard from too many people, the nurse, who was followed in a department store. The college student denied an apartment tour. The elderly man asked to show ID at a bank he'd used for 40 years. Their story had become a vessel for others' pain, and they couldn't just cork it back up. So they made a decision. They declined the offer, not with anger, not with drama. Just a simple, clear email. Thank you for your gesture. But true accountability isn't measured in free meals or donations made in our name. It's measured in changed behavior, transparent policies, and systemic action. We respectfully decline your offer and encourage you to direct those resources toward long-term, verifiable change, not symbolic repair. They didn't send it to the press, didn't post it online, just hit send and close the laptop. But word got out anyway. Within hours, the restaurant's PR team was scrambling. The owner had hoped the generous offer would close the chapter. Instead, it opened a new one. Reporters called asking why the couple had refused. Food bloggers debated whether the gesture was sincere or strategic. On social media, people praised their integrity. They're not here for crumbs. They want the whole table. The pressure on the restaurant intensified. Michelin, still reviewing the case, now had even more evidence that the initial response was performative. Investors who'd been silent began asking tough questions. One major backer pulled out entirely, citing reputational risk. Meanwhile, the couple took their next step. They filed a formal complaint with the city's Human Rights Commission, not just for themselves, but on behalf of any guest who'd experienced similar treatment. They didn't ask for money. They asked for an investigation, public findings, and binding changes to the restaurant's operations. It wasn't about punishment. It was about prevention. The legal process moved slowly, as these things do. Paperwork, interviews, depositions. But while they waited, they didn't stay quiet. They partnered with a local civil rights organization to launch a new initiative, Dine with Dignity. It wasn't a protest. It was a resource. They created a simple, anonymous online form where people could report experiences of bias in restaurants, cafes, bars, anywhere food was served. The reports were reviewed by trained volunteers, then shared, with permission, with health departments, licensing boards, and community groups. The goal wasn't to shame individual servers or hosts. It was to expose patterns, because one rude comment could be a bad day. 10 reports about the same place. That was policy. Within weeks, hundreds of submissions poured in. Not all from their city. Some came from across the state, even other regions. People described being seated in back rooms, ignored by staff, charged higher prices, or accused of not belonging. One woman wrote that she'd been asked to leave a wine bar because her natural hair made other guests uncomfortable. Man shared how he was accused of stealing a wine glass just for holding it while waiting for his date. These stories had been buried for years. Now they had a home, and the couple made sure they were heard. They organized a community listening session at a local library. No cameras, no press, just chairs in a circle and a promise of confidentiality. Over 80 people showed up. Some cried. Some spoke with quiet rage. Others just listened, realizing they weren't alone. One older woman, her hands trembling slightly, said, "I stopped going to nice places 10 years ago. Not because I couldn't afford it, because I got tired of proving I deserved to be there." That line stayed with them, because that was the real cost of nights like theirs. Not the wasted reservation or the hurt feelings, but the slow erosion of joy. The way people learn to shrink their dreams, avoid certain spaces, settle for less, just to avoid the pain of being told in 1,000 small ways that they don't belong. Back at Le Jardin Étoilé, the fallout continued. The manager who'd ordered them out was gone, but so were half the front-of-house staff. Morale was low. The new diversity consultant they'd hired, a respected local advocate, reported that the kitchen staff, mostly immigrants, had long felt invisible, overworked, and underpaid. Real change, she said, had to include them too. The owner, to his credit, didn't fight it. He implemented a wage review, added paid training days, and created a staff advisory council. It wasn't perfect, but it was movement. Still, the damage to the brand was deep. Reservations never fully recovered. The once packed weekend nights now had more empty tables than full ones. Regulars who dined there for decades quietly shifted to other spots. And then the final blow. Michelin removed the star. Not with fanfare. Just a quiet update to their guide. No explanation, no statement. But everyone knew why. In the culinary world, losing a Michelin star wasn't just a setback. It was a death sentence for a place that built its identity on exclusivity. Within a month, rumors swirled that the owner was looking to sell, but the couple didn't gloat. They knew the real victory wasn't the restaurant's fall, it was the rise of something else. Because while Le Jardin Étoilé was fading, other tables were being set. Black-owned restaurants in the city saw a surge in support. Reservations booked out for months. Local food festivals added more diverse vendors. A new culinary incubator opened, offering kitchen space and mentorship to minority chefs. One evening, they visited a small soul food spot that had just opened in a neighborhood long ignored by fine dining. The owner, a woman who'd worked in corporate kitchens for 20 years before saving enough to open her own place, greeted them like family. "You don't know what your story meant to us," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "People started coming here not just for the food, but because they wanted to eat somewhere that saw them. They ordered fried catfish, collard greens, and sweet potato pie. The food was incredible, rich, honest, made with love. But what stayed with them was the feeling. Relaxed, welcomed, normal. No one watched them. No one questioned them. They were just curse on the drive home," she said. "This is what we wanted that night. Not the fancy plates or the wine list. Just to sit together, feel safe, and enjoy a meal." He nodded. "And now more people will get to feel that. Because someone finally said, enough." The legal case wrapped up quietly a few months later. The Human Rights Commission found credible evidence of discriminatory practices at Le Jardin Étoilé and issued a formal order. Mandatory third-party audits for 3 years. Public reporting of guest demographics, anonymized, and mandatory anti-bias training for all staff. With certification required, the restaurant complied. Not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. But the couple didn't stop there. They used the momentum to push for citywide change. Working with council members, they helped draft an ordinance requiring all restaurants with liquor licenses to post a clear anti-discrimination policy, visible to guests, and to provide a simple way to report concerns. It wasn't revolutionary, but it was real, and it passed. By the time summer rolled around, the story had settled into the city's memory, not as a scandal, but as a turning point. Tourists still walked past Le Jardin Étoilé, now under new management and rebranded with a more inclusive name and menu. Locals mostly went elsewhere. But the lessons remained. For the couple, life returned to its rhythm. Work, walks with the dog, weekend errands. But something had changed inside them too. They no longer apologized for taking up space. They walked into stores with their heads higher, spoke up when service felt off, taught their nieces and nephews that dignity wasn't something you earned, it was something you claimed. And they kept celebrating, not just anniversaries, but small victories. The first Black-owned restaurant to win a local Best New Eatery award, the high school that added bias training to its hospitality program, the day a young couple told them, "We went to that new bistro downtown, and they treated us like royalty. Thank you for making that possible." They never wanted to be heroes, they just wanted to eat dinner in peace, but sometimes, peace has to be fought for, and sometimes, the quietest no echoes the loudest. A year after that night, they threw a dinner party. Not at a fancy restaurant with white tablecloths and hushed voices. Not in a place where they'd have to prove they belonged. They hosted it in their own backyard, under strings of warm fairy lights, with mismatched chairs borrowed from neighbors and a long table made from old wooden doors someone had salvaged from a renovation project. The guest list was small, just 20 people. A mix of old friends, new allies, and a few faces they'd only known through messages and meetings over the past 12 months. There was the high school teacher who'd shown their video to her class, the young chef who'd opened his first pop-up kitchen after being denied loans for years, the former hostess who'd sent the handwritten letter and now ran a mentorship program for hospitality workers of color, and the owner of the soul food spot whose collard greens had become their comfort meal. Everyone brought something, a dish, a bottle of wine, a story. There was laughter, the clink of glasses, the smell of grilled vegetables and slow-cooked ribs drifting through the air. Music played softly in the background, not piano or jazz, but the kind of soulful R&B that made you sway without thinking. It felt like a celebration. And it was, but not just of their anniversary this time. It was a celebration of what had grown from that single, painful night, the seeds of change that had taken root in unexpected places. As the sun dipped below the rooftops and the lights glowed brighter, they stood up to say a few words. Not a speech, just something real. "We didn't plan for any of this," they began, holding hands like they had that first night outside the restaurant. "We just wanted a quiet dinner, to remember 10 years of love, of showing up for each other, of building a life, but the world had other plans." They paused, looking around at the faces lit by candlelight. What happened to us wasn't new. It's happened to so many people in so many places for so long. But this time people listened. Not because we were special, but because enough of us were tired of pretending it wasn't happening. They talked about the letters they'd received, the strangers who'd shared their own stories, the small businesses that had changed their policies because they didn't want to be the next Le Jardin. They spoke about the city ordinance that now protected guests in every licensed restaurant, about the culinary fund that had already helped 3 new Black-owned eateries open their doors. And none of that would have happened, they said, if we'd just walked away quietly. After they sat down, the chef stood up. He was in his late 20s, wearing a t-shirt that read, "Seasoned with Justice." He cleared his throat, a little nervous. "I used to think I had to be twice as good just to get a seat at the table," he said. "But you two showed me something different. You didn't ask for a seat. You reminded everyone that the table belongs to all of us." Later, as dessert was served, homemade peach cobbler with vanilla ice cream, they walked around the yard, checking in on guests, refilling drinks, laughing at old jokes. The dog dozed under the table, belly full of scraps. It was ordinary. Beautifully, wonderfully ordinary. And that was the point. Because real change isn't always loud protests or viral videos. Sometimes it's a backyard full of people who finally feel safe enough to just be. Meanwhile, across town, the old restaurant stood quiet. Le Jardin Étoilé was gone. In its place was a new spot called Common Ground, a collaboration between the original owner, who'd sold his stake but stayed on as an advisor, and a collective of local chefs, most of them women of color. The menu blended French technique with Caribbean, West African, and Southern flavors. The staff was diverse, trained not just in service but in cultural humility. And the seating? Open, equal, no quiet corners hidden in the back. They'd been invited to the opening night, but they'd politely declined. Not out of bitterness, but because they didn't need to go back to that space to feel whole. Their healing wasn't tied to that building. Still, they heard good things. that the food was excellent, that guests lingered for hours, that people actually talked to each other, across tables, across differences. The Michelin guide hadn't returned a star, and no one seemed to care, because the real measure of success wasn't a rating from a secretive panel in Europe. It was whether a black couple could walk in, sit down, and enjoy a meal without having to carry the weight of history on their shoulders. And now, in that space, they could. Back at the backyard party, the evening wound down slowly. Guests helped clear plates, wrapped leftovers in foil, hugged goodbye with promises to meet again soon. By midnight, it was just the two of them sitting on the porch steps, sipping the last of the wine. "You know," she said, leaning her head on his shoulder, "I used to dread anniversaries after that night, like it would always be tied to that humiliation." He wrapped an arm around her. "But now it's tied to this. To us saying no and the world saying yes." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the crickets and the distant hum of the city. Then she smiled. "Remember how we used to joke that our ideal Friday was takeout and bad TV?" He laughed softly. "Yeah. And now we're hosting community dinners and meeting with city council. We're still us," she said. Just louder. And they hadn't become activists overnight. They were still the same people who loved rainy Sundays, argued over thermostat settings, and saved the last bite of dessert for each other. But they'd also become something more: witnesses, catalysts, builders. A few weeks after the party, they launched their foundation. They called it the Table Project. Not because it was about food, but because a table is where people gather, where stories are shared, decisions are made, and belonging is practiced. The foundation had 3 simple goals. First, to provide grants to minority entrepreneurs in the food and hospitality industry, especially those turned away by traditional lenders. Second, to support schools and training programs that taught not just cooking or service, but ethics, equity, and inclusion. Third, to keep the Dine with Dignity reporting system alive, now with a small paid team to ensure every submission was handled with care. They didn't want to be the face of it forever. They hired a young woman who'd interned with the civil rights group to lead day-to-day operations. Their role was to open doors, not hold all the keys. The first grant went to a woman who'd worked as a dishwasher for 15 years, while saving to open her own tamale shop. The second went to a nonprofit that taught formerly incarcerated people culinary skills. The third helped a group of immigrant women launch a catering co-op. None of it was flashy. But it was real, and it was theirs. One afternoon, they visited a new cafe funded by their first grant. It was tucked into a neighborhood that had long been overlooked by investors. Bright murals on the walls, plants hanging from the ceiling, the smell of fresh bread and spiced coffee filling the air. The owner, a soft-spoken woman with kind eyes, greeted them like old friends. "You gave me more than money," she said. "You gave me belief." They ordered 2 lattes and sat by the window watching people come and go. Students with laptops, elders reading newspapers, young parents with strollers. Everyone was welcome. Everyone belonged. As they left, the woman handed them a small loaf of banana bread. "For your table," she said. They carried it home like a treasure. That night, they sliced it thick, toasted it lightly, and ate it with butter and quiet gratitude. Because this simple, shared moment, was what they'd been fighting for all along. Not fame. Not revenge. Not even justice in the grand, sweeping sense. Just the right to exist fully, joyfully, unapologetically, in a world that too often asked them to be less. And now, they were. The story didn't end with a perfect happily ever after. There were still places where people like them would be questioned, watched, or turned away. Bias didn't vanish overnight. Systems didn't transform with a single apology, but something had shifted. People were paying attention, speaking up, choosing differently, and that was enough. More than enough. On their 12th anniversary, they didn't make reservations anywhere. They stayed home, cooked a simple meal together, pasta with garlic and olive oil, a salad from their garden, store-bought cake with 12 written in shaky frosting. They ate at their kitchen table, the same one where they'd read that velvet-wrapped apology a year before. No cameras. No speeches. Just 2 people, 10 years of love behind them, and a future they'd helped reshape, not by seeking the spotlight, but by refusing to disappear from it. Outside, the world kept turning, but inside, at their table there was peace, and that, after everything, was the greatest victory of all.